In late October of 2019, after spending too many months working overtime at my marketing job in Boston, I decided to rent a small log cabin near Stowe, Vermont. I wanted fresh air that smelled of pine instead of car exhaust, and nights quiet enough that I could clearly hear my own thoughts. The cabin was located along a gravel road called Tucker Lane, about 4 miles outside of town, surrounded by sugar maples that had already turned fiery shades of red and orange. Janice Evans, the cabin's owner, messaged me that the closest neighbor was roughly 50 yards away through the trees. She seemed proud of the privacy it provided, and at the time I appreciated it greatly. I left Boston before sunrise on Monday, October 27th, and took Interstate 93 until mountains appeared on both sides of the highway. Around 10 o'clock that morning, I reached Stowe, stopped at Shaw's grocery store on Mountain Road for supplies, and then drove north along Route 100. A small wooden sign for Tucker Lane stood tilted slightly by the turn. After a quarter mile, the pavement ended, and my rental car rattled over the rough gravel road. Soon the cabin appeared on the left, looking like something straight from a postcard. It had fresh log walls, a green metal roof, and smoke drifting gently from a chimney. Through bare branches, I could barely see another house further uphill, a 2-story farmhouse the color of faded bone. Its windows were dark, and I assumed this was the neighbor Janice had mentioned. Inside a lockbox was the cabin's key. The interior smelled pleasantly of cedar and old wood smoke. The main room had a couch, a stone fireplace, and a small kitchen. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom furnished with a queen-size bed, a dresser, and a window that faced the old farmhouse. At the back, a sliding glass door opened onto a deck overlooking a shallow stream. After placing my bags down, I started a fire with some birch logs and sent a quick text to Janice, letting her know I'd arrived safely. She replied with a smiling emoji and reminded me to latch the deck door at night, mentioning that black bears sometimes wandered nearby. I spent the rest of the day doing simple chores I'd usually rush through back home, like sweeping leaves off the porch, putting groceries away, and brewing coffee just to enjoy its aroma. By late afternoon, the sun dipped behind Mount Mansfield, making the air sharp and cold. I put on a jacket and stepped outside to watch the sky darken. That's when I first saw him. He approached along the tree line between the two properties, a man likely in his late 60s with rosy cheeks from the cold and gray hair flattened beneath an old Vermont Catamounts baseball cap. Carrying a silver thermos, he waved when he noticed me. I waved back, expecting him to keep walking, but instead he turned toward my porch. "Evening," he said warmly, stopping at the steps. He spoke softly with a gentle Vermont accent, blending words smoothly together. Thought I'd introduce myself. I'm Harold Jensen, and I own the old white place next door. I told him my name and mentioned I was renting the cabin for a week. Harold chuckled, saying it was a nice time of year for some peace. We chatted casually for around 10 minutes about the colorful leaves, early frosts, and the best spot in town for apple cider donuts. He kept a respectful distance, gripping his thermos as if warming his hands. Before leaving, Harold tipped his cap and said he usually walked around 5 o'clock each evening, and if I happened to be outside, he'd welcome the company. I thanked him and wished him good night. After he vanished into the trees, I thought how pleasant it was to meet a friendly neighbor, almost like something from a storybook. The following morning, the cabin windows were foggy from the wood stove. I cooked bacon and eggs and spent hours on the deck reading a paperback I'd planned to finish months ago. The only sounds were the cries of crows, the soft rush of the stream, and the occasional distant car passing along Route 100. Around 4 o'clock, I hiked a short stretch of the Catamount Trail, enjoying the crunching leaves beneath my boots. When I returned, dusk was settling in, and I lit the porch lantern. Right on time, Harold appeared from the shadows, stepping closer than the previous day. He wore the same cap and a heavy canvas coat. "Hope you found the trail okay," he said kindly, his watery blue eyes gentle. I said I had, then asked him how long he'd lived here. "My whole life," he replied. His family had bought the property before World War II, adding jokingly that things had been quieter back then. We talked briefly about Boston, and he mentioned liking Boston college hockey, teasing me that I might support a rival team. I noticed his hands shook slightly when he drank from his thermos. After about 15 minutes, he politely excused himself, saying he didn't want to delay my dinner. Again, he tipped his hat and walked back toward his farmhouse. I watched as he reached the porch, opened a side door, and slipped inside. Briefly, a light flickered behind a window curtain and then quickly went dark. That night, my dreams were ordinary, filled only with the quiet murmur of the stream outside. Wednesday morning arrived gray and rainy. I drove into town, browsed the shops along Main Street, and had lunch at Butler's Pantry. Back at the cabin, I built a stronger fire and listened to rain drumming on the roof. Around 5:30, a soft knock came at the front door. Harold stood outside, his coat damp from rain. "Figured I'd check you weren't drowning out here," he joked softly. I offered him to come inside, but he shook his head, saying he didn't want to track mud indoors. For about 10 minutes, we talked through the screen door. He asked about the book I was reading, smiling when he saw the cover, and recalling reading it in college, which would have been around the late 70s. Before leaving, he gently touched the door frame and advised caution if I walked at night, mentioning coyotes sometimes traveled near the stream. He then walked back into the rain, leaving only damp footprints on the porch. Thursday was Halloween, and morning fog wrapped the trees like soft cotton. I cooked oatmeal, reluctantly checked a single work email, then spent the day relaxing. By afternoon, the silence had become heavy, and I welcomed Harold's usual evening visit. He arrived early around 4:30, wearing a handmade-looking wool sweater. Standing on the porch, we talked casually about local wildlife, the high school football team, and the likelihood of snow by Thanksgiving. Curious, I asked if many renters came here often. He shrugged and mentioned not many since the trouble at his farmhouse. When I asked what he meant, he paused thoughtfully, then explained vaguely about insurance issues and storm damage, saying boarded-up houses made people uneasy. I remembered seeing his porch light earlier in the week, so I assumed he used only part of the house now. As shadows filled the clearing, Harold said he needed to check his generator before more rain came. He waved goodbye and left. For reasons unclear, I felt strangely anxious. To distract myself, I showered, made pasta, and later opened my laptop to leave a polite mid-stay review for Janice. Casually, I mentioned Harold as a friendly neighbor. Immediately, Janice replied, confused, asking, "What neighbor?" Surprised, I clarified, describing Harold Jensen from the white farmhouse. Her next reply made my heart pound. "I don't know anyone named Harold." That house has been empty since Arthur Jensen disappeared in 2016. It's been boarded up ever since. I felt a cold chill, not panic exactly, but the deep unease when something familiar suddenly feels wrong. Quickly, I told Janice I'd been talking with Harold each evening. She immediately replied, "No one lives there. Should I call the sheriff?" Rationally, I wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, but my heartbeat raced. After thanking Janice and reassuring her I'd be fine, I walked to the bedroom window and looked toward the old farmhouse. Moonlight showed boarded-up windows and no porch lights. I stood frozen, imagining Harold somewhere out in the darkness, possibly watching me. That night's sleep was difficult. Every crackling log startled me awake. Deep into the night, the fire had reduced to glowing embers, and I heard quiet footsteps on dry leaves outside. They paused by my door, but no one knocked or tried the handle. Still, the silence felt heavier than any noise. Checking my phone, it was exactly 3:12 a.m. I stayed awake, wide-eyed, until dawn slowly arrived on Friday. In the morning, I tried convincing myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe Harold was a caretaker and Janice simply wasn't aware. Or maybe he was living there without permission, but was harmless otherwise. Feeling restless, I brewed coffee, burning my tongue as I drank too quickly, and decided a walk into town might clear my head. I set out down the gravel road toward Route 100. Halfway along, I passed a small clearing and saw fresh footprints in the damp soil, larger and wider than mine, leading straight toward the boarded-up farmhouse. The prints looked recent. The edges hadn't crumbled yet. Uneasy, I continued walking. When I reached the highway, I briefly considered turning right toward town, but instead I crossed the road and went directly to the Stowe Police Department. It was tucked behind the town hall, a small brick building that looked more like a library than a police station. Inside, a single officer sat behind a desk. His badge read G. Perrin, and he listened calmly as I explained the situation. He asked standard questions: Harold's height, hair color, any distinguishing features. I mentioned the Vermont catamount's cap and the silver thermos he carried. Officer Perrin nodded, said they checked the property, and firmly advised me not to confront anyone myself. He took my cell number, promising he'd call if they found anything. After thanking him, I stopped at the Green Goddess Cafe for a sandwich and headed back to the cabin. The afternoon dragged slowly. I tried reading but couldn't concentrate. The wind shook loose plywood somewhere, and each sudden noise made me jump. By late afternoon, storm clouds had drifted over the mountains, turning the sky the color of wet slate. Part of me expected Harold to walk from the trees again, but the clearing remained empty. I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. Around 7, heavy rain began pounding down at an angle. Nervously, I turned on every lamp in the cabin, hoping brightness would chase away the fear. As I heated soup on the stove, a sudden thump came from outside. Then another, slower, like someone cautiously stepping onto the porch. Quickly turning off the burner, I stood frozen, barely breathing. The window by the door showed nothing but darkness and my own scared reflection. Then came a muffled voice through the storm, clear enough to recognize. "Evening." Sorry to drop by late. My throat tightened. It was Harold's voice, yet this time it sounded less friendly and more urgent. "Could use some shelter," he said. "Power's out at my place." Every instinct told me not to open the door. Instead, I forced myself to reply calmly that I had already called the police about him. Silence followed. For nearly 30 seconds, I heard nothing but heavy rain striking the roof. I imagined Harold standing just inches from the door, surprised or angry. Finally, he spoke again, softer and almost pleading. "I'm just your neighbor, friend. No need for police. Place gets lonely, that's all." Another pause, then quietly, "You said we could chat." I didn't answer. Another long minute passed before I heard a single heavy footstep descend from the porch, followed by the sound of his footsteps retreating through mud toward the farmhouse. I stood motionless until the smell of scorched soup snapped me back to reality. Shaking, I dumped the burnt pot into the sink and grabbed my phone, calling Officer Perrin's direct number. He assured me a patrol car was already headed my way, about 20 minutes out. He urged me to stay locked inside and not confront anyone. I thanked him, ending the call. Suddenly, lightning flashed, briefly turning every window blinding white, then black again. In that split second, I saw someone standing halfway between the cabin and the farmhouse, unmoving among the trees. The next flash revealed nothing but empty space. My pulse pounded so loudly I could hear it. Finally, just after 9 o'clock, red and blue lights flickered up Tucker Lane. 2 police cars parked near the farmhouse. Officers shined flashlights across the porch, front door, and old siding. From my window, I watched them circle the building. One officer climbed onto the porch, tried the side door, then forced it open. They disappeared inside and emerged minutes later, shaking their heads. One pointed toward tracks in the mud. Another officer followed the footprints with his flashlight until the beam disappeared into dense underbrush. 15 minutes later, Officer Perrin approached my cabin. I let him in, noticing his coat dripping rain onto the doormat. "We found evidence someone's been inside," he explained calmly. "Food wrappers, a sleeping roll, personal belongings. But no one's there now." The thermos you described was sitting on the kitchen counter. I asked if the name Harold Jensen meant anything. He flipped through some notes. Arthur Jensen bought the property in '86, reported missing in December 2016. No immediate family. He cleared his throat. "We'll keep looking. Probably someone illegally using the house. Maybe a drifter pretending to own the place." I almost told him how Harold had mentioned living there all his life, knowing local stories and history. But the words felt strange, almost unreal. Officer Perrin strongly suggested I leave for the night, if possible. In less than 10 minutes, I packed my belongings into a suitcase, threw it in the car, and drove toward town, officers following closely behind. I checked into the Trapp family lodge, where Janice had reserved a room. Sleep came in broken pieces, with dreams of wet footprints in a silver thermos repeatedly jolting me awake. By morning, the rain had stopped, and clouds hung low, making the mountains look bruised purple. I checked out early, grabbed coffee, and headed south toward Boston. Near Waterbury, cell service returned, and I saw a voicemail from Officer Perrin. His voice was quiet. He said they'd found additional evidence inside the farmhouse. Upstairs, there were family photos of Arthur Jensen, including one clearly matching the man I'd spoken with. The picture was dated 1998. They'd also found a death certificate. Arthur Harold Jensen, born 1956, presumed deceased since January 2017. Officer Perrin ended by saying they would continue investigating, but there was no sign of anyone currently on the property. He encouraged me to call if I remembered anything else. Back in Boston that evening, I opened a picture I'd taken of the farmhouse on my first day. When I zoomed in, something metallic flashed in one bedroom window, a blurred reflection in the shape of a cylinder. The image quality was poor, and it could have been anything. Yet my mind immediately pictured the silver thermos. Weeks passed, and life gradually returned to normal. Deadlines, noisy subway rides, and neon lights flickering outside my apartment window. But sometimes when the city's power flickers out and the room goes briefly dark, I recall that gentle voice outside the cabin door, asking softly to be let in, explaining that it was simply lonely. This happened to me when I was in college. I was 21 in early June of 2021, fresh from finals at Western Washington University in Bellingham and exhausted from 3 straight nights studying. My roommates were all leaving for the summer, but I still had 2 weeks before my part-time library job started again. I wanted peace and quiet, the kind where you can hear your own breathing clearly, so I rented a tiny cedar cabin on Airbnb. The listing said it was situated on 5 wooded acres off Lost River Road near Mazama, a tiny community in northern Washington, a few miles from the Canadian border. Photos showed a small single-room cabin with a wide porch, a pot-bellied stove, and large windows facing the dense forest. It sounded exactly right. I left Bellingham early on a cloudy Monday morning, drove east on Highway 20 through Cedro Woolley, and climbed toward Rainy Pass. Patches of snow lingered along the roadside, but the sky cleared as I descended into the Metho Valley. After Winthrop, cell phone service faded. The road grew narrower until it was just cracked asphalt, winding among tall Douglas fir trees. A handmade sign reading Riversong Cabins pointed down a gravel road. My small Honda bumped along until it reached a clearing. There stood the cabin, fresh cedar siding, green metal roof, and a porch swing overlooking the woods. I met Mary, the host, a retired teacher who lived nearby. She handed me an actual metal key, not a digital code. "No Wi-Fi here," she smiled. "Call the landline if you need anything. Cell signals don't reach past Winthrop." I thanked her, appreciating the isolation, and carried my bag inside. That first night felt like the start of a meditation retreat. I brewed coffee, sat on the porch swing, and listened to the distant rushing of the Methau River. Around 10, I lit the wood stove, read a paperback by lantern, and fell asleep to the stove's quiet ticking. When sunlight woke me, a strange sight immediately caught my attention. Just outside the window, about 3 feet from the porch, sat a small, neatly stacked pile of stones. Each rock was about the size of an egg, stacked into a neat cone about 8 inches tall. I assumed an animal had moved stones from the driveway, but the pile looked too carefully arranged. Curious, I went outside, nudged it with my shoe, and the stack toppled easily. Shrugging it off, I made oatmeal and spent the day hiking part of the Pacific Crest Trail near Cutthroat Pass. Few people were around. The second night was quieter than the first. No wind or river sounds, just deep silence pressing in. I lay awake, straining to hear any noise, until the faint chirping of crickets finally lulled me to sleep. Morning sunlight again brightened the room. I rolled over and froze. Another stone pile, exactly like the first, stood just outside the window, neat and precise, perfectly centered right in front of the window where my head had rested. I stumbled back, nausea rising. That stone pile hadn't been there at midnight. Someone had built it while I lay asleep, less than 6 feet away, separated only by thin glass. I yanked the curtain closed, hurriedly packed clothes into my duffel bag, and shoved my feet into hiking boots. My hands shook so much I dropped the car keys twice. Outside, the morning air was cold and damp. I scanned the trees, half expecting someone to emerge, but nothing moved. I considered driving straight out, yet anger started mixing with fear. Instead, I marched across the clearing to Mary's house. Mary answered the door in her bathrobe, her eyes widening at my panicked expression. I blurted out everything: the stone piles, the creaking porch, the scraping noise. To her credit, she didn't dismiss me. She put on coffee and immediately called the Okanogan County Sheriff's Office. An hour later, a deputy named Ramirez arrived. He was in his late 30s, calm with a steady voice that eased my nerves. He walked around the cabin carefully. Kneeling near the porch, he pointed to flattened grass underneath, then used his flashlight to peer beneath the floorboards. "Someone's been crawling under here," he muttered. Ramirez lay flat and slid halfway under. When he emerged, he held a dirty blue sleeping bag, a crushed protein bar wrapper, and a cheap LED flashlight with dead batteries. "These aren't yours, right?" he asked. I shook my head firmly. He took photos, then led me into the woods behind the cabin. A narrow trail I hadn't noticed earlier wound deeper into the trees, showing patches of fresh footprints, slightly softened by rain. About 50 feet in, the trail opened into a small clearing, about the size of a living room. In the center stood another stone pile, taller, maybe 2 feet high, and beside it, an old Army surplus backpack leaned against a stump. Ramirez unzipped it with a pen. Inside were men's thermal pants, canned beans, a hunting knife in a worn leather sheath, and a spiral notebook. Many pages had been torn out, but on one remaining sheet, someone had scribbled rows of tally marks and repeatedly written the words, "Night Visitor." My legs felt weak. Ramirez called for backup to search the area, then walked me back to the cabin. "Pack up," he said gently. "I'll follow you to the highway." As I quickly shoved my belongings into the car, Ramirez stepped onto the porch and studied the windows. "Did you notice anything else last night?" he asked. "No, just the porch creaking. Maybe the swing," I replied. He pointed. The swing's chains were still, but another detail made my skin crawl. The window had smudged outlines of 2 palms, as if someone had leaned close to peer inside. I followed Ramirez's patrol car down the gravel road, my heart pounding whenever shadows flickered across the windshield. At the paved highway, he waved me on and turned back toward the cabin. I drove nonstop to a motel in Winthrop. locked myself in a second-floor room, and kept the lights on until morning. That afternoon, Ramirez called. Detectives and a tracking dog had combed the property, but found no trace of the man. They'd followed his footprints through the woods until they disappeared near a service road. "Looks like he'd been sleeping under the porch at least a week," Ramirez said. "He probably watched guests coming and going, waited until he saw someone alone, then got braver each night." I asked about fingerprints, the notebook, anything to identify him. "No matches yet," he said. "We'll keep the evidence. Mary's installing motion lights and cameras, but I wouldn't recommend staying there again." I emailed Airbnb from the motel lobby. Their support team gave me a refund and a bland apology. Later that night, before driving home, I sat in my parked car scrolling through pictures I'd taken on my first day. The cabin, the river, sunset through the trees. In one photo, snapped at dusk outside the porch, I noticed something I'd missed earlier. Between two distant fir trunks, there was a pale oval shape. Zooming in until pixels blurred revealed a face, featureless in low light, but unmistakably human. Someone had been watching from the trees as I smiled cluelessly at my camera. My stomach twisted. That meant he'd been there from the very first night. The stone piles hadn't been warnings. They were markers showing how close he dared come. By the third night, the stones touched the cabin, and so had he. On Highway 2, I repeatedly checked the rearview mirror, even in broad daylight. Every time a car followed for more than a mile, I changed lanes. Back home in Bellingham, I spent a week sleeping on friends' couches, too anxious to stay alone. Even now, 4 years later, I refuse rentals where hosts boast about isolation. I need neighbors, street lights, the comforting hum of distant traffic, the constant presence of other people. Some find peace in silence, but I learned silence can conceal someone who's already too close. Years have passed, but I still replay small details. The first stone pile must have taken minutes to build. He assembled it mere steps from my sleeping head, confident I wouldn't wake. The second pile showed he'd returned after I'd kicked the first one apart. The third proved he'd grown braver, placing it directly against the window. I wonder what would have happened on the fourth night. Ramirez guessed he might have tried the door, maybe only intending to scare me. I don't share that optimism. The knife found in his backpack suggests something darker. I once asked Ramirez if they'd ever found him. He said no, but suspected a drifter who wandered between national forests each summer, unnoticed. The notebook and backpack went into evidence, but without a name, the case grew cold. Sometimes I imagine hikers stumbling upon a hidden campsite miles off the trail, discovering the words "night visitor" scratched into bark or stones stacked in neat small towers. That image jolts me awake, sweating, in the middle of the night. Friends say I was unlucky. I tell them the opposite. I was incredibly lucky. Lucky the porch creaked when it did. Lucky Ramirez took me seriously. Lucky the man ran instead of confronting me. But luck is just chance disguised. Chance brought him to that cabin before me, allowed him to watch unseen, without bars on windows, and to blend his quiet footsteps into the silence of the forest. By choosing complete isolation, I'd given Chance every advantage. People love using the word remote in travel blogs, treating it like a badge of courage or authenticity. They post photos of tiny cabins under vast starry skies, praising the absence of neighbors. These pictures get countless likes from city dwellers craving escape. Meanwhile, I find myself staring into the backgrounds, scanning for a pale blur hidden among the trees. I still hike and camp, but never alone. I never sleep in a place where no one would hear a scream. If that means missing out on the absolute quiet of remote wilderness, so be it. Silence isn't empty. Sometimes it's full of footsteps you don't notice until they've stopped right outside your door. I have loved wild places for as long as I can remember. My earliest memory is standing on a weather-beaten porch high in the Colorado Rockies, breathing air so clean it stung my lungs. I was 8 years old, bundled in a bright red parka too big for me, watching my dad unload fishing gear from our old Ford Bronco. The porch belonged to a tiny log cabin 6 miles west of Leadville, near Turquoise Lake Road. My parents found it through a neighbor who knew the owner, and for 3 summers, we drove up from Denver to spend a few August nights there. I'd wake before dawn to hear elk calling from the valley and fall asleep to wind gently rustling through lodgepole pines. Those trips permanently planted the mountains within me. Ever since, when city traffic feels suffocating and endless emails flood my screen, my mind drifts back to that porch, the scent of pine sap, and the comforting thought that the world is still open, peaceful, and good. 21 years later, I needed that feeling again. I just finished an exhausting software rollout, eating takeout dinners at my desk for weeks. My eyes hurt, my head buzzed, and my Denver apartment felt like a cave filled with electronics. So I opened Airbnb, typed in Leadville cabin, and there it was, a familiar slanted roof, rough wooden railings, and the same view of pine trees stretching down toward Turquoise Lake. The listing mentioned recent renovations, including solar panels and reliable Wi-Fi, but everything else, the location, porch, even the dusty gravel driveway, matched pictures from my childhood album. The host profile said Heather, but the original owner's name, Alvarez, still appeared in the description. Without hesitation, I booked 6 nights. On Monday, September 5th, I loaded my Subaru Outback with groceries, a DSLR camera, and Porter, my aging golden retriever mix, and headed west along Highway 24. The sky was perfect blue and aspens along the Arkansas River were beginning to turn golden. 90 miles later, I reached Tennessee Pass, felt the air grow colder, and every breath tasted crisp.